So this episode number 37 is with the absolutely terrific Geoffrey Kane. Geoffrey Kane is an award-winning foreign correspondent, author, technologist, and scholar of East and Central Asia. He has written for The Economist, The Wall Street Journal, Time, Foreign Policy, New Republic, The Nation, CNN, MSNBC, BBC, and so on and so forth. He is an exceptional investigative journalist operating out of Asia. He's a Rhodes Scholar, studied in Vietnam. He's got an exceptional resume. What do we talk about in this chat? It is about his latest book, a book by the title of The Perfect Police State. And it is overwhelming. It is truly overwhelming. The level of dystopia that Geoffrey reports from China is truly overwhelming. The details of that are unraveled in our chat, but it heavily centers around just two pillars: the subjugation of the ethnic minorities in the Xinjiang province and elsewhere throughout China from the self-proclaimed superior Han ethnicity, and the increasingly prevalent surveillance state on the other pillar. The surveillance state is something we all sort of well know about. We know that China's got a social credit score. We know that WeChat dominates their lives. We know that the CCP has their very dirty, grubby paws operating throughout the nation, domestically and also internationally as well. We know this. But how well do we know it? And also, how much credence do we give it? How much time do we give it to adequately assess the level of dystopian depravity that is happening in this nation? Anecdotes such as a Uyghur Muslim family having the father removed to be taken to a re-education camp only to be supplanted by a Han ethnic man who is now the supposed head of the family. And the whole family has to just to pretend that this is their new dad now, with the security camera installed into the corner of their living room, which has audio as well, so they can overhear what they're talking about at dinner. It is unbelievably dystopian. It's horrific. And Geoffrey does an exceptional job to document this. And so that's what we speak about. To make a rather awkward but I think necessary pivot, I want to remind everyone that's listening to this how grateful I am that I have the opportunity to actually speak directly to you in your ear. Because it is remarkable. The internet's huge. There's functionally an infinite distribution. Yet somehow, the audio waves from my voice are coming through your ear. It's amazing. Let's double down. Let's double down on that, okay? So I am operating multiple podcasts. If you're hearing this on the Geopolitics and Podcast feed or on YouTube, there is the flagship podcast. It's called A Curious Worldview. Interviews from a slew of guests. Geoffrey Kane, obviously being the one that you're here to listen to now. But just last time, it was Geoff Raby, former Australian ambassador to China. Stephen Hicks, the week before, talking about Friedrich Nietzsche. Lots of cool stuff. Jack Weatherford, the author of Genghis Khan, The Making of the Modern World. Back in the early days, we did 3 hours of Jack. There's a lot of good stuff happening through this podcast. The hardest part of this content creation is the discovery side of things. It is truly as a situated domain of extremistan as there exists. And if you know, you know. If you don't, check out the Nassim Taleb and Inserto podcast. It's an inquisition to risk randomness and uncertainty through the prism of the ideas of Nassim Taleb. There's a lot happening, a lot of content that I'm creating. What I want to do is start getting the algorithm to work in my favor. So roll up your sleeves. And if you're interested, pump your good juice into the algorithm. Leave reviews, subscribe, tell a friend about it, watch it 100 times. I don't know. Whatever you can do to help me, I greatly appreciate. Okay, so what can you expect from this chat? Geoffrey and I start by documenting the sort of history of the conflict between the ethnic minorities of China and the Han ethnicity of China. Culminating to the re-education camps, which is just new speak for concentration camp and elimination camp. And it is not too hyperbolic to suggest genocidal camp. And then on the other side of the conversation, we document the ever-prevailing surveillance state in China and what its implications are, and how, not surprisingly, a lot of business interests in the West are heavily steeped in as well. China is the second largest economy in the world, yet they act, and we all still trade with them, despite the fact that they are currently doing their best to erase an ethnic minority from their nation. Let that sink in for just a moment. Here is my chat with Mr. Geoffrey Kane.
Okay, Geoffrey Kane. Good afternoon, good morning. It's good morning for you, afternoon for me. Thanks for joining me, mate.
Thanks for having me, Ryan. Good to see you here.
Cheers, mate. So, you've just published this book, The Perfect Police State, and the themes of it are really, is what we're going to speak about today. So, tell me if this is a good framework to sort of approach the chat. the way I see it is the book has two themes which run alongside each other initially, but then overlap for the majority. And that is the progressing dystopian reality of surveillance in China on one hand, and the other is the centuries-long conflict between the Han ethnic Chinese and the various ethnic minorities of the Xinjiang province. So they're the two sort of themes of the book, and then they overlap at a certain stage. So before we get into speaking about those topics, because that is obviously the crux of the book, you spend quite a bit of time at the beginning, like laying out your authority on the matter, you know, that confirms your interview and your research, which basically just doubles down on the notion that this isn't second, third, fourth hand information. These are first hand interviews and research. So,
Yes. So Ryan, we did 168 interviews, and when I say we, I mean it wasn't just me doing the interviews. I had 3 assistants in the process of writing and researching this book. We scoured the world. We were in Washington D.C., in Turkey, Kyrgyzstan, parts of Central Asia. These are all places that have large Uyghur populations, refugee populations who have left China in the past few years, and also populations from other minority groups that that have been put in camps, like the Kazakh people, the Kyrgyz people. These are all predominantly Muslim groups in Western China that have been targeted for re-education because they come from the Islamic faith and they have a different culture from mainstream Chinese culture. So 168 interviews total, not only with refugees, but also we tried to broaden the net to as many credible people that we could find. These included, diplomats from various countries who have been also documenting the issue, human rights investigators, researchers, kind of human rights watch type people. Lawmakers. We spoke deeply with the Turkish government, which is deeply involved in the Uyghur issue, trying to protect the Uyghurs in their own country who are refugees. There's a debate on whether to send them back to China, whether they have a place in Turkey. The Uyghur Human Rights Project, they do great research and investigations. We went around the world and just, tried as hard as we could to make sure that this story was extremely well documented down to the T, down to the dot, just cross the T's, dot the I's. Because, whenever there are, whenever the news of an atrocity comes out, there's a long history of deniers in the West in particular, also in other countries. For this particular issue, many denialists in the Muslim world, the Middle East, trying to claim that these atrocities are not happening. But we need to be sure that a book like this has strong legs to stand on, that that these legs can't be simply knocked down and swept away, and then the book is just falling flat on its face. That would not look good, for an atrocity. For documenting an atrocity. It gives fuel to the Chinese Communist Party. It gives fuel to a lot of villains out there.
100%.
So, yeah, exactly. And also, we didn't just rely on our own interviews, but there is a body of research throughout the book. I wrote it in a way that made it clear that, me and my publisher were not the only people, documenting this. This is something that it's an atrocity that's been well documented. There are other researchers who've gathered vast collections of interviews and victim testimony. A lot of this has been confirmed through multiple witnesses, and also there are also lots of these procurement documents that have been published in Chinese that the Chinese government doesn't think foreigners are going to see, but they do see it. They translate it, and they talk about how they're building re-education centers and vocational centers, and they specifically say we need this much steel, this much concrete, we need this much for this space, for this many people in this location. There is a lot of documentation out there now that proves that these camps exist, and this is not an overplayed hand by an American imperialist threat or something.
That's what I'm afraid the issue sort of gets knocked down as in people's mind, as almost a touch conspiratorial, because how can something so bad be happening and we not fully understand it, and that the New York Times isn't on the ground reporting it firsthand? Like, how could it be possible that something akin to genocide, which is not too much of an overstatement to make, is happening and we don't know about it. So that's why I wanted to ask you that first off, to like confirm that there is an authority, that this isn't a conspiratorial issue. This is investigative journalism of a human rights atrocity that is ongoing and current in the second biggest economy in the world. So I just want to sort of put that there at the start to sort of foreshadow just how big the issue is, and also as a legitimizer to everything that you're about to say in terms of the history of the ethnic minorities in the Han Chinese, and then also the prevailing surveillance state. At the end of the book, I forget the organization that it was now, so you can correct me, but they said that this right now, the re-education of the Uyghur Muslims, is the greatest humanitarian disaster of this century so far. So just to like be hyperbolic with it and say how bad things really are, that's what's been said.
Oh yes, it's terrible, and I agree. I think that so far in the 21st century, we are witnessing the unfolding of authoritarianism, of a new authoritarianism that didn't quite exist before. This is an authoritarianism in China that rests on the psychological torture and the control of minds, the ability to wipe somebody's identity clean and to put in, propaganda and information that simply makes them a new person. It has, many echoes of George Orwell, but even George Orwell in 1984, I don't know how many listeners, 1984 is one of those books that a lot of people talk about, but few people actually read it.
Yeah,
and even 1984, I don't think goes far enough to show what's happening to the Uyghurs in China. I think that it's much closer to Minority Report, the Tom Cruise movie from about 20 years ago, which was also a novella by Philip K. Dick, an author who I've always admired. He did the Blade Runner books and all that.
Oh, really? Cool.
Yeah. The book that Blade Runner was based on. But Minority Report is a movie about this pre-crime division. They have these precogs, which are essentially psychic psychic humanoid beings that live in this police department that can foresee murders before they're going to happen. And so this pre-crime division of the police, they have the legal authority to send in the special forces and sweep in and arrest people before they've even committed a crime that they might be planning, that they might be premeditating. But that creates a whole series of paradoxes, because if you stop a crime before it happens, then no crime is going to be committed. So therefore, you can't. It's one of those sci-fi books that explores these interesting themes.
Yeah.
And when they are
subject to enormous corruption.
And yes, that is what happens in the movie. Also in the movie, when people are arrested for their pre-crimes, they're given this headband that just puts them in this sleepy coma, and they're just housed away the rest of their lives. They're just looking at images of rainbows and unicorns in this. It's just it's truly one of the. I think it's one of the scarier dystopias, because at least when Steven Spielberg was planning the film, he had whole teams of people who were studying, where the future was headed, and how can we make a future world that's realistic, that 20 years from now it might look like something that could actually happen. And now this sort of thing, obviously not in this psychic paranormal way, but this similar thing is happening to the Uyghurs now in China, because they are under a massive predictive policing program. Rather than having psychic human beings, they have an AI system called the IJOP, the Integrated Joint Operations Platform, which it's this AI-driven database of just everything that everyone does in the region of Xinjiang in China. So cameras will observe them, like, do they go in the front door or the back door of their house? Are they late for work a certain day? Do they buy certain products at the grocery store? Do they refill their gas at a certain time? Are they doing anything that might be unusual or off for what their schedule would usually be? And based on all this data that's being gathered, it ranks people on their trustworthiness, and then it sends notifications on the smartphones of police officers who are at these pillboxes on almost every street corner, and tells them, oh, you have a potential future terrorist. There's someone who might be plotting a terrorist attack because the AI, found something odd. Like maybe he, it could be anything. So one of the most bizarre cases I heard was that a Uyghur had bought the tools to build a tent to go camping. And so he was, the police knocked on his door and said, you're being arrested under this predictive policing. The AI had noticed something like this and had bumped, kind of notified them to arrest this guy. And they said, you're being taken to a detention center, which is a concentration camp. And that's where you're going to have your thoughts harmonized. We're going to cure the ideological viruses in your mind. We're going to, cure the they use, so the Chinese authorities use this medical language that's kind of dystopian and Orwellian and terrifying to me. They say, you have a cancer in your brain, you have a virus of the mind. They call it the three evils. They've infected you. This is religion. So it's extremism and separatism, and all these sorts of things. So this is how the system works. It's essentially it's a predictive system using this giant artificial intelligence dragnet that just looks at everybody and says, you will commit a crime in the future, you're going to a camp, we're going to harmonize you and brainwash you and indoctrinate you. And that's what the Uyghurs are living through. It is the true dystopia, just like Minority Report in so many ways, just like what Philip K. Dick predicted. And not only that, but the numbers in these concentration camps are humongous. There are an estimated, at the higher end, an estimated 1.8 million people out of a population of about 11 to 12 million people, ethnic minorities in this region. So that's about 1 in 10 people. I mean, imagine if in America or in Sweden or wherever, if one person from every 2 families simply disappeared because they were told that you're going to commit a terrorist act in the future. They just simply, police knocked on their door at the night, or they were called to the local station, and one person from every small neighborhood, every cluster of houses is simply gone. Usually a young man, because they think young men are more prone to crime. And they're just in this camp, and nobody really knows what's happening to them. And then maybe one day they return, and they're just wiped. Their identity's wiped, and they're simply not who they were before. They're just reciting propaganda.
But it sounds unreal. You're just explaining that anecdote there of the Uyghur who bought tools to make a tent, and he's legitimately being put in a detention center because of the AI system that said he was going to commit a crime, some sort of terrorism. It is unbelievable to hear, and that's why I think people can sort of dismiss it as some sort of conspiratorial chat, because it's so impossible to imagine that a society could degrade to that state. But the thing is, it happens a little bit at a time. So let's tell the story. Let's first explain the history of the Uyghur Muslims and the ethnic minorities in the Xinjiang province against the Han Chinese ethnicity. Let's start there, tell their story, and then introduce how China's surveillance state comes in.
Yes, certainly. So when I wrote the book, I did want to make this a book of history and geopolitics as much as it was about the Uyghur atrocities, because a lot of this story doesn't make sense unless that big picture context is in place. So the Uyghurs come from traditionally a Silk Road region. The Silk Roads were the network of trading routes that existed since ancient Persia, ancient Greece, and Rome. It was silk going from the east, from China, moving west, and then the Romans would sell gold and tin and copper headed east to China. It was a massive one. For its time, it was just a very complex, very sophisticated network of routes that predated European powers, seafaring powers. And so there were numerous tribes and kingdoms and peoples along these the Silk Roads that they typically ran through Central Asia, what is today Pakistan and Afghanistan and Kazakhstan. These were major stopping points. Iran, these are the places that today are often seen as basket cases, are just swelled in conflict and authoritarianism. But back then, these were very prosperous kingdoms. So Western China, Xinjiang, what is today Western China, was then one of these. What was a series of kingdoms, a number of kingdoms that were ruled by many different peoples. The region had a history of both political independence and being ruled, but it was never an authoritarian place. I think that compared to many of the other kingdoms of the time of say 800, 900 years ago, it was a relatively liberal, prosperous kingdom. Kashgar, the Uyghurs, they always had a sense of cultural and political and linguistic independence from other peoples. And it wasn't, so there were Chinese invaders who came in, the various dynasties, did technically control this region, but they tended to take a hands-off approach because it was so, they knew that it would be costly to impose their will. It was I think that China exerted a more Roman style of conquest, like just, conquer them, let them be, and, let them practice, and we'll just tax them, leave them alone. It actually wasn't until the 20th century, quite recently, that the heavy-handed repression truly began. There was a civil war in the 1930s over the region, the Soviet Union versus the People's Republic, or what would become Communist China. It wasn't communist yet, but communist forces were in a struggle over who could make this region a satellite of theirs. The Soviet Union very wanted to have something at China's doorstep, and so there was a lot of factionalism during that period. And once the Chinese Communist Party took over, after 1950, that was when really the deep repression, the terror started. I'm sure that audiences will know that the Chinese Communist Party does not have a wonderful historical record of taking care of its people. There was the Great Leap Forward, which Chairman Mao created a famine, created the Cultural Revolution as a tool of keeping power, which led to the purges of just millions and millions, the estimated deaths of almost 2 billion people.
Isn't Chairman Mao the Glorious? Isn't he credited with the most deaths of any man in history?
Yeah, I think he might be up there. I'm actually not sure who the number one would be. I mean, I would imagine that Stalin would, have something up there, just because, Stalin in World War II, it was like, if you weren't on the side of Stalin, you just had a gun to your temple, and that was that. I don't know. I would imagine that Mao is right up there, but also I think that if we look at proportion of the population that was massacred, it might actually be Pol Pot in Cambodia. About a quarter of the entire country was wiped out for being from the wrong class, wrong ethnicity.
The thing with Chairman Mao was just it was like a self-inflicted failure of policy where genuinely 20-30 million people perished.
Yeah.
And there's so much ambiguity of the numbers.
Yeah, what Chairman Mao and the Chinese Communist Party did is they took a nation an empire that for many years had been prosperous, that it was already on the decline, but they took it and raped and pillaged it for themselves under the guise of having a people's revolution, created a famine to start out with, tried to cover up the famine, and in the process, caused more atrocities, and then went on and had the cultural, instigated this cultural revolution for Mao to ward off all the people who were vying to take power from him because he had messed up terribly. A lot of this in China, people in China, I'm sure many people here have maybe been to China at some point. People know about this. You can talk to taxi drivers, you can talk to local students, and they'll they know what happened. It's not a mystery to them. They're not that brainwashed by the propaganda, but they'll often be careful, and they'll say things such as Chairman Mao was 70% good and 30% bad, and you have to wonder, what does that mean? Well, what they're saying, maybe there are lots of people who do support the Communist Party who don't want to smear Chairman Mao. There are others who are just afraid of being arrested for defaming the great glorious leader.
Yeah.
But this is ultimately, so going back to Xinjiang in Western China, this is really when the terrors started. It was Cold War era, communist era. The Chinese Communist Party was deeply concerned about separatist movements in this region. Central Asia had always been a hotbed of uprisings for these communist regimes. Stalin in Central Asia, in the Soviet Union, and Gorbachev, they purged the heck out of this region. They took people and shipped them off to camps and shipped them to other regions, displaced them. And China sort of had a similar approach to Xinjiang. There wasn't a whole lot different there. So what happened? The Cold War ended. It's 1991, 1989, and what happened was that so after the Soviet Union collapsed, the Chinese authorities were deeply concerned that if they had taken the same path as the Soviet Union, they too would collapse, and that also involved the independence of all these Central Asian states that were previously Soviet. And so the Chinese authorities throughout the 90s started stepping up their security measures in this region. There was a group called the Shanghai Five. This is like a counter-terrorist group that included Kazakhstan and China and other countries who wanted to band together and fight terrorism. But really, the major turning moment was the September 11th attacks in New York. It was the moment that with this, there was a new enemy. There was this terrorist enemy, Al Qaeda. The U.S. troops were headed to Afghanistan, and Chinese authorities seized on this because they realized that Xinjiang is right on Afghanistan's doorstep. They feared having a Taliban influence in this region of Xinjiang. They were worried about extremism and jihadists and terrorist attacks, and they actually had a real concern. I mean, this was not all made up. The Chinese authorities, there were terrorist attacks in this region. There were extremists who were Uyghur, who did return from Afghanistan and later from Syria in the Syrian civil war, who did kill civilians and kill people.
And there was a faction of fundamentalist Islamic Uyghur Muslims who wanted to sort of bring down China, more or less. Like the Han Chinese were the enemy. So there was genuinely some terrorist factions as well in these regions. It wasn't just China using a propagandistic excuse to take over some people.
Yes, there was a threat. So the group was called the ETIM, the East Turkestan Islamic Movement, which had camps in Afghanistan. Now the thing is that back when China launched its own war on terror in 2001 and 2002, the threat was it was a much smaller threat than what the authorities had said. They did have real concerns, but this was not on the level of like a Twin Tower collapse. This was not on the level of like Xinjiang was not going to be embroiled in civil war between jihadists and communist forces fighting for struggle for the region. They simply didn't have the numbers. They didn't have the power. And historically, the Uyghur people had always been a more moderate. They're Sunni Muslims, and they tend to come from a more syncretist, kind of moderate form of the religion that incorporates lots of shamanistic practices and indigenous practices. So we're not talking. This is not Saudi Arabia. This is not Wahhabists, where people are being told to go become martyrs and kill the jihad or kill the infidels and all that. I mean, Xinjiang is a bit more relaxed. But there was a threat. But in the process of responding to the threat, China just blew it up and created it. I mean, just created something. Created this boogeyman that was just far beyond what the actual threat was. It was heavy-handed repression. There was vast inequality in Xinjiang at the time, and there were protests in 2009 in the capital of Urumqi. And the Chinese authorities, responded with disappearing young men who they thought were involved, torturing them, beating them with rifle butts, sentencing people to, just mass sentencing to prison. People were executed. It was a heavy-handed response to what really, to a problem that was, a small number of extremist terrorists among a larger population that were just simply unhappy with the way China was ruling them as this colonial, modern colonial power in their region. So in the process, now we're in 2009, 2010, and this is really where the events of the book start to kick off, and it's when the surveillance state is created and the dystopia, starts to get rolling.
More than just the threat, though, you documented a few different attacks against the Han Chinese that did happen in the book. And from my understanding, there was one or two legitimate sort of knife massacres where people killed a lot of people with knives. But then there was also sort of like burning of the Reichstag events as well, where it seemed like China almost faked terrorist attacks to, further embolden the propaganda against the Uyghur Muslims and the ethnic minorities of the Xinjiang province.
Yes. So one of the biggest calls to action was there was a knife attack at a train station in China that was in 2014. So the president at the time, Xi Jinping, was deeply concerned, and he had a real reason to be concerned. There was also one attack on Tiananmen Square, which it's sort of like attacking Times Square in New York.
Yeah.
And it was a suicidal car attack. There were numerous attacks throughout Xinjiang at the time. There was the first attempted airplane hijacking since 9/11 was actually in this region of China, but the hijackers were overpowered and restrained and, ultimately arrested. They did not succeed. There were various instances of, people say like throwing a grenade into a vegetable stand. Numerous innocent people died. There was the assassination of an imam or an Islamic leader in Kashgar, for not being, for being a turncoat, supposedly. So, there was a lot going on. There was a terrorist campaign in the region. But one of the big problems, and I tried to, stress this in the book, is that so many of the reports that come out from official Chinese media are propaganda. And, they might claim that there's a Uyghur, terrorist behind the attack, but there's really no way of knowing for sure, because it's not like we can show up at the trial and, take notes, take photographs of the suspects. We really can only rely on what China is telling us. And even, so this was not in the book, but it didn't make it in. But I mean, if you remember the WikiLeaks with what's his face, when Assange leaked all the State Department cables, there was one cable in there. It was the FBI director Mueller back under the Obama administration. He got a visit from one of China's national law enforcement officials, and they were trying to urge the FBI to take all these attacks seriously and to help China track down terrorist suspects. I mean, so this guy was rebuffed by the FBI, but China was actively lobbying and campaigning to try to get the world to see this as these are real terrorist attacks, and these are not made up by us. But the thing is that they responded and they said, well, show us the evidence. I mean, can you just show us that there's a Uyghur behind this, that this wasn't just simply made up? So that's one of the...
And then the line went dead.
Yeah, line went dead.
Okay, perhaps because what I'm trying to do is just establish for the listener a good understanding of what the ethnic relations are between these two people of China, and then that will serve as like a great context for the whole surveillance state, and it will make a lot of sense how China can then think that they can get away with this, and how they actually are collecting the Uyghur Muslims and so forth. But you have some terrific anecdotes, horrific but also terrific, from the book about some of the anti-Uyghur propaganda that is at play. So could you maybe just comment on that a bit and really paint a picture for us, which is one of flat-out racism and enemy rhetoric from the Han Chinese against the ethnic minorities of China?
Yep. So, one way to think about this situation in China is maybe think about the American expansions through the West, the Manifest Destiny, when the Native Americans were displaced, and the Protestant Christians were attempting to convert all these cultures into kind of this monochrome Protestant Christian English speaking culture. So I guess you could call it a cultural genocide. I know that the word genocide can be controversial when talking about the Native American issue, and I don't want to. I'm not an expert on that topic, but it's a similar kind of a similar dynamic of attempting to move into a frontier, a Wild West, and to either to convert or displace the local indigenous population and make them more like you. It has lots of echoes of South Africa apartheid. There's that relationship of
Australia and the Aboriginals.
Yeah. It has a lot. It has echoes. Even it's not a perfect comparison, but it has patterns that are certainly similar. And Xinjiang, this is the Wild West of China. This is the frontier. this is where, if you're Han Chinese and you're coming from the cities on the East Coast, we're talking the equivalent of New York and, Washington, D.C., Philadelphia, and you're looking for, these coasts are overexploited. There are too many people. It's crowded. It's getting expensive, polluted, and you're looking for opportunity. You're looking for, like the gold rush. Except in this case, you're looking for maybe the oil rush, or you're looking to help build the railroads. Yeah. You would migrate out with the encouragement of the government. Migrate west. You would be put in Xinjiang with your family. You would move into a new high-rise development that's being built there. There's massive urbanization that's been going on. And you would kind of show up and you would be this frontier entrepreneur. A lot of people go there and they open factories that make garments. They grow tomatoes. This region is very good for its like tomato growing abilities. Cotton fields are big. So you can tell by the industries that I'm naming that it sounds kind of like a frontier. And I am mentioning cotton and tomatoes farming, and a lot of these farms are actually they're built on exploited Uyghur labor, and it's often slave labor. It's just forced slave labor where they don't get paid. So this is this is what's happened since the end of the Cold War. There's been this massive Han influx, this redevelopment of the region. There's even a paramilitary force called the Bingtuan in the region that operates as this sort of, it's a state within a state where the Han Chinese can go there and they have their own schools and their own support networks. Yeah, and what they've been doing in the process is pushing Uyghurs off their historical homeland. They've been making it so expensive for local people that, local people can't get jobs as easily. They're discriminated against. There are often, like, say, two lines at the gas station or at the bank where one is for Uyghurs and one is for Han Chinese. So in the process of populating and settling in this frontier, the Chinese have ended up creating an apartheid state where there's an underclass of Uyghur Muslims and Kazakh Muslims, and then there's a ruling class of Han Chinese settlers who are essentially taking over. I think that would put this into context for audiences.
Yeah, no, that does. Really, really well framed. I really like that, thinking of it through that sort of framework, the apartheid, the idea that there is a ruling ethnic class and everyone else, despite whatever traditional ownership or rights to the land that they have, they are second class, and they are here to serve us, not the other way around. There's nothing mutually beneficial here. It's a real case of taking and being taken from. So some of the anecdotes of some of the anti-Uyghur propaganda, a lot of the clothing, traditional clothing of these ethnic minorities is either flat out banned, or it's very well known that you would be sort of silly to wear it in public. Obviously all the traditions, languages, even furthermore in the schools, they're like teaching an alternative history. There is this heavy sort of indoctrination that their own culture is really bad and that the Han Chinese culture is the good one, and it would be a privilege for them to be able to adopt the Han ethnic Chinese set of morals and worldview. So along these lines of these anecdotes, could you just really hammer the nail down and highlight just how bad the anti-Uyghur propaganda is in China and in these regions specifically?
Yes. So a lot of this started in 2014. 2014 was really the year when China's authorities just began outlawing Uyghur practices, just simply began erasing Uyghur customs and saying, you can't do this, you can't do that. So one of the first measures was to ban beards for men under 60. This was around 2000, the mid-decade, when the authorities just made an announcement. They said, if you have a beard, you are in violation of the regulations of the region of Xinjiang, and you will be taken to a center or taken to a re-education course. This was not, the concentration camps had not been open at this point, but they were still people were being sent to re-education courses where they have their beard shaved, and they would have to recite propaganda all day just to be set in line. So beards this is an Islamic culture, and beards are often, a deep Islamic symbol. They did not ban them for men over 60 at first, just because it's expected that men over 60 would all have a beard, and I think they even saw that as too repressive.
Okay.
But over time, a lot of this changed, and over time, these rules just kept getting more and more extreme. At one point, veils were banned. Women, they weren't outright banned, but you were in danger if you were wearing a veil in many places. The police could arbitrarily detain you. Gatherings of certain numbers of people were banned, or they were scrutinized at least. And, if you had a gathering of, say, it really varies by the township and city. It's hard to say for sure, how much it is in the entire region, but if you had 5 or more people at a gathering in your home and you were, say, drinking tea together and just chit-chatting, having some fun, the police would often show up and check everyone's ID. If it seemed suspicious, they tell everyone to disperse, or they would just, if it were really suspicious, they would arrest people, take them to a camp. This was the start. The start was really banning these cultural institutions, these cultural practices. But over time, starting in about 2016 and extending to the present, the authorities in this region just expanded the repression, the erasure of these cultural institutions to just levels that were unseen. And, now they're not just saying you can't have a beard in public. Now they're saying we're going to bulldoze your local mosque and we're going to build a parking lot on it. And the justification the government gives is, well, we have too many mosques in this region. We have, there's like way too many mosques in the town, and why don't we put that land to better use? Let's build parking lots and build roads and build modern institutions on top of them. But really, the real reason is to erase this culture, to try to erase the Uyghur culture and make them Han Chinese. So it's not just mosques, though. It's just general cultural institutions. So, high schools and gymnasiums, that sort of thing. A lot of them have been cleared out and repurposed into concentration camps, or they're called officially, they're called detention centers or re-education centers. Or vocational training centers. There are lots of different names for these places. And it was starting in late 2016 that this network of concentration camps just started popping up. It was growing vastly. There was a new leader in town. His name was Chen Chengguo. He's the party chief of Xinjiang. He had come from Tibet, where he pioneered many of these tactics, and he got a mandate in Xinjiang to clear out the place, make it secure, build a total security state. And so, he and his people were the ones who said that we are going to extend all these camps, and we're going to, simply erase the identity of these people. They even, in official reports and official propaganda, there are lots of quotes from Chinese officials who were building these camps, and they would say, you can't just pull out the weeds, you need to spray the entire crop. You need to, you can't just, we're not just going to open you up. Yeah. They use terms like this. We're not just going to, we're not just going to open you up and take the cancer out of you. We're going to do a full rehabilitation. We're going to make sure that, everything that is wiped away, and that you're going to become a new people. Your minds will be freed and cleansed. You're not going to be weighed down by this Islamic religion anymore. You're going to, emerge as the Han Chinese. You're going to be just like us once you're done with all this. That's what's been happening.
Yeah. Okay. That last inflection perfectly rounds out just how bad the situation is in terms of the way that the Han ethnicity is viewing the Uyghur Muslims. So let's get into. Obviously, we get to where the state of things are now, where you have millions of disappearances and all the other crimes associated. But to get there, can you now lay out the story of a more progressively surveilling state over time?
Yeah. So, originally, when the surveillance state was set up about 10 or so years ago, it was based on traditional policing tactics. So throughout the previous decade before that, there had been a kind of renaissance in the region among Uyghurs. There were all these websites that were popping up where people would post their literature and poetry, and they would talk about politics. There were even web forums where Han Chinese and Uyghurs they would come together and talk about sensitive topics, politically sensitive topics, like what's happening in the region, how can we reconcile, what do the Uyghurs need, and after these protests happened in 2009 and then these terrorist attacks happened, really China started strengthening the human aspect of the policing. There were neighborhood watch groups that were set up where there would be these government minders who would go around and inspect people's homes and talk to people, kind of government snitches living among the population. There was lots of heavy-handed policing, brutality. There were if you were a young man, you were in danger. If you were a young guy in your early 20s, kind of mid 20s, you were seen as suspect, and you might be taken away and interrogated and beat up a little bit, and then they kind of let you go at some point. It was that mood, and this is what a lot of authoritarian states do. There was nothing surprising about what China was doing in Xinjiang at that time,
right?
Just because it's just we've seen that playbook. China's done it before. Russia's done it. Turkey's done it. That's what these states do. Mm-hmm. So what got I guess what was alarming was during the middle part of the last decade, around 2016. That is when the actual surveillance state itself began extending into the realm of technology. For this book, I had interviewed Uyghur technology workers. I told one of their stories in the book. And one of the big problems that they had before this time period was that China was just such a vastly secretive and opaque state that the government didn't really know much about its own people. I mean, it claims that it's all watching and all knowing, but ultimately the government did not really have good data on its people. Various offices did not share data with each other. A lot of it was, say, gathered at the local level, but the national level didn't really know what was going on. And so when these technology workers were building these AI systems and these camera systems around Xinjiang, they had this problem of data. Like, okay, well, we have cameras everywhere, but we can't identify someone a lot of the time. There was a purse snatching. Well, he got away. We can't. It's like we have a million cameras, but like not one of those cameras can say, this is Mr. Wong from Urumqi and he just stole a purse, and go arrest him. And so they began expanding the surveillance state into the realm of software in particular. There were a number of tools that were extremely useful for the government. One of them, according to my Uyghur sources, was WeChat. WeChat is the WhatsApp of China. One of the most used apps in the world, not just in China, but around the world, people use WeChat.
Yeah. I think it is the most used app in the world.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. By all the metrics, by users, daily users, time spent, everything, because it's all encompassing for your entire life.
Yeah, it's all encompassing. It's an app that lets you do everything, and I guess that's in 2021 that's more normal now to have an app that can just, it's a Swiss Army knife and it'll do whatever you need. But in China in 2012 and 2013, this was very new. I mean, it was like a new app that could like literally just do anything, and in the process, that meant that the app could gather data on everything you were doing. So the authorities in Xinjiang, use this app, and according to my sources, so I don't. The Chinese government has never admitted this or has never published this, but according to my sources who were inside the system, building the surveillance state, they had requested the WeChat app to hand over first metadata and then all the messages in the app, and then they would be stored in this region of Xinjiang for 2 years. And this is when this is around the time that the technology workers began experimenting with AI to see, doing textual analysis of these messages to see if they could locate potential terrorists, and they would cross-reference and look for connections between words like bomb and gun, and then trying to figure out if someone was going to commit a terrorist attack at some point. It was a crude system, and they admitted to me that it was not a sophisticated. Like it wasn't like a Terminator, like Terminator, like the Skynet system is going to rise up and take over everyone's, whatever. But
Yeah.
it was a system that laid the basis for what's happening today. And so this surveillance started getting out of control in 2016. At one point, so one of the Uyghurs who I interviewed, a woman named Mason, that's a pseudonym.
Yeah,
she
she's
had
the main sort of through line interview of the book as well. Her story is unbelievable. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, well, yeah, I wanted to tell it because I just thought her story was so just beyond anything that that I thought that I thought could exist. And she had come home from studying from overseas, and the government found that suspicious, so they ordered her and her family to install a government camera in her living room. And this would be a camera that would hook up to the local police station, and that would be feeding data on her and her activities to whatever AI system was being developed at this time.
Yeah, audio as well.
Yeah, audio, everything. It was listening in.
It's completely dystopian.
It is extremely dystopian. And so it was this overuse of AI. The government had built an AI system that I don't think it totally understood how it worked. I mean, I think that I think that they were using crude algorithms and crude data that, they had lots of data, but it was crude data. It wasn't, sorted out and parsed nicely. And I think that whatever data they had put into this algorithm. The data, they trained the algorithm to look for different connections. And perhaps they overtrained it at some point, and they said, just find every connection you can, and maybe that person's a terrorist. Like, just, we'll accuse people of being terrorists, and then we'll just, they'll all go to camps anyway, and that'll sort them out. Like, even if they weren't terrorists, so what? They'll come out better people, better citizens if they're getting brainwashed in the camp.
I wonder how much of that last thing you just said, like, oh, well, if they're not terrorists, at least we're doing them a favor by re-educating them. In my eyes, that sounds just like the words that you say, but the intention is totally different, which is just we want to get rid of these people, or here is another, slave that we can use to increase our cotton yield, right? Like, that's kind of what I think their incentive are, but then the words are different. Do you think they actually... And this is obviously speculation, but do you think that the Han Chinese, they want to actually sort of re-educate and integrate the Uyghur Muslims into their society? Or is this all just some sort of ruse to actually use them for free labor and all the rest?
It is it's both. I think that you hit both points. I think that, yes, the Chinese businesses do want to use cheap and free labor from Uyghur forced laborers and slaves. But also, I think that China's ultimate goal is to create a total security state. China wants to create a system where nothing is left to privacy, where the party is all-seeing and all-knowing. And they're, in their mind, so in the mind of China's leaders, they're thinking there will never be a terrorist attack in Xinjiang ever again. There will never be dissent.
Because they'll be able to
predict it. There will never be a protest or dissent ever again.
Yeah.
And in the process, this is not just AI. I've talked about AI, but there have been so many elements and sides to this surveillance state. Another one is biometric data gathering, taking people's DNA and creating a genetic map of literally the entire population of Xinjiang. It's like, if the police arrest a single, one person under predictive policing, they can look at their genetics and, who knows what they're doing with that. I mean, I don't think, not a lot has really been reported and investigated on that side, but I mean, police could look at the genetics and the AI might say, oh, well, he has this gene in his DNA and maybe this gene will be a predictor of a terrorist attack. Now, that part is just speculation. I mean, I haven't heard that directly from anywhere there. That's my speculation, but that's I guess you could say my educated speculation that they might be doing.
Exactly.
This is one of the purposes of gathering everyone's DNA. I think that, we also have to keep in mind that there's still a lot that we don't know about what's going on there. There are many black holes just because this region is so secretive, but at some point, more of this information will be coming out. I didn't intend for my book to be the last word, the final word on what's happening. I see it more as a draft of history as it's happening. And I think that, in the future, as in the same way historians went back and tried to understand the Holocaust or the Khmer Rouge or Rwanda, I think a lot is going to be written on this, and there's going to be, there are going to be volumes and volumes of just studies, archival and psychological and historical studies on what has happened to the Uyghurs and how we got to this stage.
Is it just the Uyghurs? Can you comment on the other ethnic minorities in Xinjiang?
Yes, so the Uyghurs are the predominant minority, and even the region is officially called the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region. So China sees it as the place for the Uyghurs and the place for Muslims. But that's just the official line. In reality, the region actually does have a long history of Buddhist influences. It actually used to be a Buddhist region before it was a Muslim region. And also Christian. It was a place for one of the mystical Christian sects many thousands of years ago. So it was always a diverse place, and Islam was a relatively recent development. And I say relatively because, we're talking hundreds of years, many hundreds of years. But Islam is simply the latest incarnation of what exists there. So other ethnic groups, there are the Kazakhs, who, their homeland would be Kazakhstan, which borders Xinjiang, but the further north you go in Xinjiang, there tends to be a larger Kazakh population, and these groups have been also targeted and detained.
Is it a mountainous region, or is it part of the steppe?
Up north, it's more mountainous, and there are beautiful mountains and lakes. It's a very beautiful region. And it looks like, if anyone's ever been to Kazakhstan, which is a really beautiful place, if you leave the cities and go to the countryside, Kazakhstan is just gorgeous. All the Central Asian, the Stan countries are really pretty. And the thing is that northern Xinjiang has a lot of that too. It's just that it's harder to get there now.
So 2016 was where you got up to on the timeline on the progressively more surveilling state. And you gave the anecdote of how Maysim the state had installed a security camera in her living room to spy over her and her family as they have dinner. And so they can't exactly sit around a table and speak regularly, because there is someone watching them. It's a panopticon, you don't know when they're watching, but you just know that you have to always act as if they were watching. So this is 2016, we're now in 2021. Could you explain what the situation is right now, including some of the numbers and some of the ways that people are being taken, some of the stories about how people remain missing, this crazy anecdote about how a family's father has been removed to a re-education camp, and he is then supplanted by a Han ethnic Chinese, and the whole family just has to pretend that this is their dad now, sleeps in the same bed as her, and the wife can't say no to any sort of sexual advances because then obviously she's some sort of terrorist. It's like we've said it many times. At the beginning, that's why I really wanted to confirm that this was all firsthand, because it's crazy. It's unbelievable that this could be happening from the second biggest economy in the world, So I know that I just said a lot, but the current state of affairs in the Xinjiang province, could you explain?
Yes. So this is all, it's all firsthand. It's all firsthand, but it's also reported elsewhere. So the anecdote that you talked about the party cadre or the party member coming in and replacing the husband, that's all been well documented. That's been reported. That was first reported by Radio Free Asia and then picked up by a number of other media outlets. So these party members will often stay. So what happens is that there's a member of the family who's taken to a camp. Often, so there's a program that the government runs. It's called the name escapes me at the moment. It's called the Becoming Family program, and then there are a few other official programs.
Man,
where
so much news.
Yeah, Newspeak, Becoming Family, exactly, Becoming Family, and there are. I've seen a lot of these kind of slogans being used. These program titles. Often there will be a party member or a Han Chinese who's sent out to live with a Uyghur family to kind of teach them the virtues of being Han Chinese, teaching them the propaganda virtues of the party. If the husband or spouse of some kind has been taken away to a camp already, they'll sleep in the same bed. so according to there's an official explanation, and is that during the winter times it gets cold and everyone should be in the same room sleeping together. They should be in the same bed. There was so in one of the reports I read, the official line was also that the party cadres are required to sleep at least 3 inches away from the person they're sleeping in the same bed with. I'm not sure 3 inches is gonna do a ton. I'm not sure, like 3 inches. Okay, great. Okay, so you're 3 inches away, so therefore I feel safe.
But to highlight just how absurd it would be, just how absurd it is, that person understands that 3 inches is the rule, and therefore 3 inches is going to be abided by. Like, even in the bed, at some ridiculously arbitrary rule, it will still be abided by, because it's like part of the absolute prison that has become the surveillance state of China. Like, you're always in the panopticon. You don't know when you're being watched, and if they happen to watch you do something wrong, you're gone.
Yep.
Because look, I know 5 houses on this street whose families are gone now, and I don't know where they went. And it's so unbelievable.
Yeah, it's unbelievable. It's the panopticon. It's the dystopia. But that's what the panopticon is. It's literally, so a panopticon, it's a type of prison. It's a concept. It's a prison in a circular format, and the philosopher Michel Foucault had written about it. It's this idea that all the prisoners are on this they're in this outside circle. Their prison cells are on this outside circle, and then inside they're all facing inward towards this guard post, this sentry post, where the guards are watching them, but they can't actually see the guards. The guards are behind an enclosure of some kind, and so like, you might be a prisoner looking at this guard post. You can't see anyone there, but then you don't know, like, is there a guard standing there looking at you right now? Or is there is he actually watching Netflix right now? Is he, like, not paying attention? Is he is he like meeting his secret lover behind that screen for a little affair for the weekend? Like, or does he have a special listening device? Is he, like, holding up some kind of like, listening device to his ear and listening to everything you're doing in your cell, and listening to if you're talking to anyone? This is a concept that that has appeared in Western philosophy as kind of a thought experiment on how to control a population, how to control, in industrial times it was supposed to be a tool for controlling workers, making sure that they were staying at work at the factories. But it's never really appeared until now in the form of these advanced technologies like AI. And that's what makes this so terrifying, this dystopia. The Uyghurs who I interviewed, they describe Xinjiang as just one giant panopticon, where there are all these cameras everywhere, and there is all this data being gathered on everyone. Everyone is constantly being watched and having their movements gathered and their everyday activities gathered, but no one really knows for sure when or how they're being watched. Like, is it I'm sitting in the classroom, I'm in my school, like, is there someone in a government office somewhere who just decided to type my name in and focus in on me today? And then are they going to find something, and are they going to take me away to a camp for no reason at all? I mean, for nothing that I could possibly predict. And that's what keeps people under control in this region. It keeps people under their toes. It also leads to a massive breakdown of trust that has been very just incredibly beneficial to the rule of the Communist Party, because when no one trusts each other, it's a divide and conquer. I mean, you can get people to snitch on each other, to spy on each other. I interviewed one Uyghur spy who had defected spy now, who was actually hired to spy on his family for a long time, and he admitted that some of his family members...
He did it as well, didn't he?
He did it. He did it because he wanted to save his mother, who was being tortured in a center. And so they took away other family members. They never released his mother, as they promised, because that's how they operate. It's like they just use whatever chips on the table they can to get you to spy on people So this is the panopticon, and this is what's so scary. And even Uyghurs who are now refugees living overseas, they've escaped the very worst of it, and they live physically in freedom. They've gone deep in our interviews into the psychological effects of what it's like to live in a panopticon, because once you reach that stage, like even if you do escape, it's been so internalized in your mind that even if you're living in Washington D.C., you have a house and kids and a family there, have a job, you're speaking English now, you're integrated with the society. You have this feeling, this weight that you walk around with of, am I being watched? Is my smartphone watching me? Is there a camera somewhere as I drive to work? Can I trust the police? Should I say anything? Should I think? Like, you really internalize that system, and you just become paranoid everywhere you go, and that's what's so devastating about it.
Yeah, that's the story of Maysim, isn't it? She came out through the re-education center, and then for years almost became a recluse, right? Because she couldn't, every interaction she had to like turn on and be like, what is the right answer here? Are they trying to trick me? And it's unimaginable the effect that living in that sort of panopticon would have. And I think you describe it very well there, because it is on the spectrum of freedom of, you being able to behave according to your own interests, to, with whatever that means. On the spectrum, it's complete freedom, and then in the panopticon, where you might not be locked up in a prison cell. You might still be able to go to the shop and cook your favorite meal. You might even still be able to go get coffee with your friends. But if you're being watched the entire time, there's never a freedom, and there's never a step away from it. Even in your own bed, you're going to be watched. Even when you're taking a shit, you're going to be watched. Like, it's just, So again, just to quadruple down on the point, it's an unbelievable dystopia that has been created in this part of the world. So also, I want to be precise so that the audience knows what the situation is right now. So I think we've done a good job at describing the context, right, and how it could happen. But what about the situation now? How many re-education centers are there? How many people do they estimate have been taken? How many people do they estimate have been killed? How many people are left? What's the development like in the region? If you could just explain right now, to the best of your knowledge, what it looks like.
Sure. So I should just preface by saying that not many refugees have escaped since 2017. I think that 2017, at least according to all the data I've looked at, is the last year that anyone in the camps got out. There are some.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean there. Yeah.
Wow.
Well, there are some. I mean there are a trickle of some people who have just managed to escape the region after that.
But so from 2017, people are no longer being re-educated. From 2017 to now, which is a 4-year period, they're being used for other purposes.
Well, they're still being re-educated, but they're being sent to forced labor. They're being released, and then they're being told you have to work for a few years as a free cotton picker, doing slave labor.
Mm-hmm.
But one of the challenges about reporting on what's happening now in 2021 is that so much of the testimony we have is from 2017 and around there, and after that it starts the testimony starts to get blurry just because there aren't many people we can talk to who've actually escaped.
Sure.
So, since 2017, most of the data now comes from, official documents. So, Chinese corporate documents where they talk about their activities in Xinjiang, because they hire Uyghur, or they don't hire, they force Uyghur workers to do slave labor for them. It tends to come from government leaks and official documentation. There have been a number of leaks from the region in the past few years where there's just been massive data put out about what they've gathered on people and how they've gathered it, which shows, by the way, that within the party there is discontent over the situation in Xinjiang. I mean, people there, leaders, bureaucrats, some of them are aghast and disgusted at what their government has done, and so they're leaking some of this to the outside world at great risk to themselves. I mean, they could be executed for that in China.
Oh yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Risk of death.
Yeah. So the situation now is that 2017, 4 years ago, that's when there were an estimated 1.5 million people that in the camps. That number has now been raised at the higher end of the estimate to 1.8 million. But that number does not include all the people who have been released and who are being sent to forced labor. So that's the cotton, the garments. A number of American companies have been caught, some unknowingly using slave labor in their supply chains. One of the problems with our globalized economic system now is that we've all become very dependent on Chinese manufacturing and Chinese factories. That there's just no way. It's very difficult to divorce our companies and their work from what's happening in a place like Xinjiang and elsewhere.
100%, yeah.
So that's really that issue has arisen as the one of the key issues since the time when I was researching my book. There's also a lot that's been going on now in the space of Chinese AI development. So China has laid down its national AI plan. It wants to become an AI leader, kind of like in this technological Cold War with America. There's a lot of speculation over whether China is actually doing a good job or whether its technology is lagging behind. I think that actually China in many ways is a paper tiger, and I think that this tech is not as advanced as they make it out to be. I mean, I think Silicon Valley.
Okay.
Yeah, I think Silicon Valley is where
reassuring take.
It's reassuring, but that's what makes the police state so powerful over there. Because if everyone thinks that it works, that's all that matters. Like if it doesn't work, if it's bad tech, and if they're arresting the wrong people, that's just going to make them more scared. So that's like you don't need. Like if the tech is too perfect, if the AI, if the algorithms are too good, then people are going to figure them out, and people are going to figure out how not to be taken to a camp. That's the irony of this perfect police state.
Okay, so the bound is between 1.5 and 1.8 million, and it's been 4 years since we've been able to directly speak with and hear the stories of people that have been released. Part of the crimes against the Uyghurs that has been documented is this mandatory sterilization and just further sort of cultural genocide, whether it's a physical genocide of the people or just the culture to be eradicated. Can you comment on some of these crimes?
Yes. Yeah, there's a lot that I could get into there. So earlier this year in January, the U.S. State Department formally called the situation in Xinjiang a genocide, accused China and its leaders of committing a genocide against the Uyghur and Kazakh people and other ethnic minority groups. Now, under international law, there are different pillars of what can constitute a genocide. I think that when most people think of genocide, they think of Nazis and death camps. They think of the gas chambers. They think of Schindler's List and the Jews marching to their death and just being gassed and thrown into mass graves. What's happening in China is a departure from the 20th century mode of authoritarianism. I think that we've departed in many parts of the world the brute force style of authoritarianism, and this is much more underhanded, and it's sinister in the way that it's underhanded and subtle, because what's happening in Xinjiang happens much slower and with much less bloodshed. Many international legal experts do agree that the situation in Xinjiang is a genocide, largely because of one key area, and that is the forced sterilization of women. Under international law, the forced sterilization of women, that is one of the markers that could, with the intent to create a genocide, that could be considered genocide, because you're erasing a population. You're doing what you can to erase an ethnic group or a certain group, from whatever country you're in.
And just to be clear, there is documented evidence of the CCP force sterilizing Uyghur Muslims.
Yes, the CCP forcefully sterilizes Uyghur women and Kazakh women with the goal of erasing this culture, erasing this people. One of the other things they do is they encourage Han Chinese men to marry Uyghur women. And then they have babies, and they're not full Uyghur, so to speak, and they'll learn the Han Chinese, they'll learn the Mandarin Chinese better. They'll be more integrated with Chinese society. But these are all measures that are intended to erase this population. Um, the Chinese government, in its own in its own official statements about what's going on, that doesn't really make a good case that it's not committing a genocide. So there was one announcement by the Chinese embassy in the U.S. They called Uyghur women baby making machines, and that's a direct quote. They said these Uyghur women are, quote, baby making machines, unquote, and we need to, like, they justify the sterilization. We need to sterilize them to ensure that the population is kept under control. So, statements like these, when you're looking at genocide, you always have to prove intent. And the Chinese government, they haven't come out and said directly, obviously, like, we're committing a genocide. No one actually says that when they're a perpetrator.
No.
But they've made a number of statements that suggest that they do have genocidal intent, or they have something close to genocidal intent that would be enough, in, say, an international court of law, the ICC. I mean, China's not a member of the ICC, but if that were to come to pass, I've spoken with a number of legal experts who say that if the ICC heard a case like this, they would probably rule against China, and they would probably declare this to be a genocide too.
Mm-hmm. So, the second largest economy in the world, which, as you pointed out, is absolutely crucial to our current globalized interconnectedness. Almost, I think it's 50% of the world's manufacturing comes out of China, 60% of the world's trade comes through China. This nation is currently participating in a attempted genocide. How is this not more spoken of, well known? Where is the sort of visceral reaction? Is it just too early for us to know? Do you think it's coming? Do people somehow just not care? I'm not sure. Like, what do you make of it?
So I have strong opinions about this. So I think one of the big problems that we've run in international affairs is that we've been sold a fundamental lie by our elites in democratic societies. Not just in America, but I think across the democratic world, across the West, we've been sold a fundamental mistruth for the past 30 years that engaging with China and working with an authoritarian regime and trading with it is inevitably going to open it up, is going to allow its people, it's going to democratize them. It's going to create a middle class that's going to want change, that they're looking out for their own interests, private property rights, privacy. China it's economically, it's one of the biggest success stories ever. In terms of the number of people that the party since the era of Deng Xiaoping has lifted out of poverty. Now, the fundamental lie is that, if you go back in history, just right before Deng Xiaoping, who was the Chinese premier who set his reforms, just go back a little bit further and you realize that the Chinese Communist Party was the institution that just pummeled the nation into the ground. From a standing of, obviously China wasn't doing great when the Communist Party took over, but took whatever was left of China and just destroyed it. Just, destroyed the institutions, seized people's lands, just killed untold numbers of people, purged them, executed them, imprisoned them. The Chinese Communist Party is responsible for this. And then we expect the Chinese Communist Party to reform on its own and then to suddenly say,
the same government that's in now.
So we're going to destroy the country, and then we're going to repair the country. So, when people, and I just said this is a major economic success story, but when you put it in that context, it's actually not a huge success because China created the problem in the first place. So I always have to, I always try to temper statements like that, and just be careful about those types of statements. So. I think that so we've been sold this fundamental mistruth about China and its future as a democratic or a quasi-authoritarian state. It's going to change its ways. It's going to join the global community. So two things happened. First of all, we integrated our supply chains and integrated our society and economy in such a vast and complicated way with China that it's now very difficult to divorce them. And in the process, we've ceded control over the principles of democracy and the principles of civil liberties and human rights to a nation that is, fundamentally at every level against these principles. That has that as a party has made clear that they don't want this. This is not in the cards. And in the process, that means that we're now buying products from a government that's willing to use Uyghur slave labor and to commit a genocide against the people and to open concentration camps. We're buying products that are tainted by this labor, and so many American companies have been caught with their pants down, saying, "Oh shoot, we are just." We're caught in this position where our supply chains are integrated. It's going to be difficult to divorce the supply chains because moving supply chains around, it's not easy. There are millions. Yeah, no, it's not.
If you're producing something in the hundreds of thousands or millions, it's a multi-year process.
You don't just pick up the phone and say, "Yeah, move it to Vietnam." I like Vietnam better. And it's a long, expensive process. You have to find the right people, the right location, the right facilities. It's just, I think the past few years have been an oh crap moment. We are working with psychopaths, and we need to figure out ways to get out of this. So there are a number of kind of these global cosmopolitan, trade supporters. So I think that Jeffrey Sachs is among the worst offenders. The man who falsely claimed to have reformed the Soviet economy, but actually just made it worse after the collapse of the Cold War. Is now making statements that America should not comment, or Americans should not talk about human rights in China because America has its own human rights problem. Whenever anyone asks Jeffrey Sachs.
Jeffrey Sachs.
Whenever people ask Jeffrey Sachs, what do you think about the Uyghur genocide? Aren't you worried about what's happening in China? That's the response. Well, we shouldn't talk about this. Just let's talk about America.
But yeah,
and it's
such a nihilistic way to look at it.
It's nihilistic.
Oh, we did something bad. We don't even have to. Don't worry about that. Look what you've done.
Yeah.
Come on.
Well, it's also a logical error. I mean, the ancient Greeks, threw that one out. That goes back very far. It's a red herring, and it's intended to distract people from the real situation at hand. Well, you did it, so why can't I? Well, the U.S. does not run hundreds of concentration camps, 300 concentration camps where a tenth of the population is being taken away. People talk about the prison industrial complex and the problems of young black men being put in prison, but these problems are not on the scale of what's happening in China. And on top of that, we have a functioning court and legal system, a functioning democracy where people can take to the streets and assemble if they need to. I mean, these George Floyd protests over the past few years, this would not happen in China. And if it did, there would be a heavy-handed party response.
Oh yeah, the heel would be down. There would be no protest, of course.
So, there's Jeffrey Sachs. Also, a number of American companies have made official statements saying that they would like to keep trade and human rights separate, which is, that's a fun. It's a
Such
weak stance, and it's a way of saying we don't care about human rights. It's a way of saying we're just here to make money. Keep the market separate from human rights. So I think that we've seen this fundamental realignment in the past few years about how we approach China. It's not just hawkish. I think that people misuse that word hawkish, in the sense we're out to hawk means you're going to aggressively go out there and you're going to you're going to threaten China, you're going to invade China, you're going to use military force. But fundamentally, what's happened is different. What has happened is that China has emerged as the hawkish aggressor, and the rest of the world, particularly developed democracies, have started to say, okay, this is going too far, and this is becoming unacceptable. And now across our society, there's been a lot of there's been a lack of elite consensus, in the Western democracies over what to do about China. But now that elite consensus is starting to form, and it's no longer going to be, we can just trade with China and keep the human rights separate. I think that these companies are they're on the wrong side of history. And, similar to in the early 1930s when Hollywood was a big, supporter of Hitler and his film industry, and, American companies were deeply ingrained in the Nazi economy as suppliers. IBM had participated in the Holocaust as a supplier of some of the technologies that were used. I think that when the history is written, many American companies are going to go down as the villains in this scenario. Might be a while it's going to be a while before that happens, but when the history is written, I think that will happen. And then there was one other point, one other trend I've been seeing. So what I just talked about was the shift of the shift from this trade liberal order to the standing up against China, but there's been this whole other shift. I think that there's been a realization that the Chinese system is not going to change, and ultimately, when you're working with an authoritarian regime, outside influence is almost never going to actually change a regime or change how it goes about its own business. If a country, if Russia, if China, if Turkey, if Saudi Arabia, Iran, if these governments want to stay in power, they will stay in power, and they'll use brute force and repression to do it. Mm-hmm. And repression, contrary to what many kind of liberal Democrats believe, what they have believed since the end of the Cold War, repression is a very effective tool when used properly. If you're a dictator and you want to keep power, there are ways that you can keep power, and you don't need to reform. You don't need to respect human rights. You don't need to negotiate with your rivals. That's actually dangerous if you're a dictator, because one opening might just be the opening that allows the house of cards to fall. Like you gotta do what you can. So I think that we've come to the realization that American foreign policy, Western foreign policy to the world is not the center of the world. It's like what America does is not going to create a democracy in Afghanistan, for example. It's not going to create a democracy in China. It's not going to, get Putin out of power. It's not going to reform Russia. This kind of change, it either comes from within their own governments, from these elites. It comes from military leaders who don't like the current leader. It comes from political rivals. Maybe throw in protests too, popular protests that give more legitimacy to it. But America can invade a country and replace a regime, but that's not a good idea. But a regime is going to stay the regime that it wants to be unless there's some kind of internal discontent. These changes come from the inside. They don't come from another country's foreign policy.
And in the surveillance state as well, any sort of political opposition is made just exponentially harder than it might have been otherwise. Because you give the example as some internal political movement could swell to the point where it can, potentially threaten the sitting CCP or a military leader. But these things in the just completely backwards newspeak bureaucracy of the CCP in the surveillance state seems like it's extremely unlikely, close to impossible, which is a shame to say. And I think something that shows China's intent quite clearly, whether it's intended this way or not, the shift of significant economic resources towards building the Belt and Road Initiative, which is coming through. Many different facets of which I actually have done a previous podcast on now. One with the former Australian ambassador to China, Jeff Raby, which hasn't come out yet, but then also one on special economic zones. But just understanding why China is doing it. Anyway, I think this is quite a clear signal, because at the moment, a huge incentive of the Belt and Road Initiative is that they can sort of retake their own trade lines and trade routes, because currently, their trade routes are secured by the United States of America, since they secure trade all around the world. So I just wanted to say that China's intentions are rather more or less being signaled this way. They're saying, no, we actually want to be in charge of our trade routes, because we might keep doing fucked up shit, and if you guys decide to not let us trade on your routes, we can at least continue some sort of trade with Central Asia and the Middle East. So I just wanted to put that in there.
Yes. Belt and Road, it's a major geopolitical maneuver. I think that there's been a lot written about Belt and Road, and and I don't think there's much doubt anymore that it's China extending its hand across Eurasia, in particular, Central Asia, everywhere to Europe. Italy's been a signatory, Eastern European countries, certain parts of the Middle East. Um, Belt and Road. It's just it's a statement of China's intent that it's going to build a sphere of influence, through the patronage of infrastructure and roads and oil and oil projects and all these sorts of big money projects, and then exchange it expects some degree of fealty from the nations that it's sponsoring, and these tend to be middle income, lower income countries. There's some data that shows that that countries that are not democratic but not totally authoritarian, who are quasi authoritarian or soft authoritarian, and middle income countries like Uzbekistan, or say what's another good example, parts of sub-Saharan Africa that are more developed. I think Kenya has done a lot of these projects. They sign on to Chinese largesse. They sign on to One Belt, One Road because they see the benefits of working with China. Not just from the standpoint of they don't just say we want Chinese technologies to repress our people. It's not that crude and it's not that simple. They actually do see a benefit because Chinese technologies are often sold at a discount. China is underwriting the construction of a lot of this infrastructure that's needed, and they can use so a Huawei project. Huawei's the big Chinese technology company. They'll build like a smart city program for Nairobi, Kenya, and the police in Nairobi can use it to catch criminals easier or to control traffic. China does a lot of this at a discount and offers a lot upfront to these countries. The problem is when China starts engaging in debt trap diplomacy.
Debt trap diplomacy.
It's a mouthful. It's a tongue twister. So it's well known that China lays down in the long run terrible terms for countries that are vulnerable. I think Sri Lanka is one example of a nation that's kind of been pillaged by Chinese projects. There have been examples of shoddy construction of dams, of highways being built to nowhere, and meanwhile these countries have taken out massive loans from China that they have to repay. But the project is not that good. China has often deals that say it'll seize it'll seize the project for itself if the country can't repay. One of the other problems is that,
or they just forgive the loan in return for ownership of the infrastructure that they've just financed.
Exactly. They'll forgive the loan. Another problem is that many of these projects, they're required to use Chinese workers, so they're not benefiting local industries. They have to use materials that were obtained by China. They have to there's a whole list of just problematic terms that just benefit China at the expense of the recipient country.
It's another amazing example of just how brazen the behavior is of China on the international stage. Up until just before COVID, I think China still yielded relatively strong soft power throughout the world. People didn't view them as a malicious force. They knew they were communists, but they also knew that millions of people were being lifted out of poverty, so how bad could they be? But since, especially I think over the last 18 months, the emperor has no clothes. Like, we're really starting to see what true intent might actually look like from this nation. And as you just documented with the Belt and Road Initiative, a lot of these projects, there's zero altruism to them at all, which doesn't necessarily make them bad. But when part of your terms is that this big infrastructure project that you're giving to a country to supposedly inject some sort of income into the nation isn't even going to use local labor or local supplies, what injection is that? And then it's like, to just brazenly do that on the international stage again and again, for me, it just signals something much larger than I think people recognize, which is like China is genuinely, the CCP is genuinely a malicious actor, does not have anybody else's best interests at heart, which, I mean, I suppose you could say no one really does have no country at least has other people's best interests at heart, but there is at least a collaboration. There is like an understanding that you can't just go around fucking other people, and not pay any sort of price for it. It's quite bizarre, right? Like just viewing over the last 18 months how things are developing.
And it's not just Belt and Road. So I think that more recently there's been more discussion over the problem of the more what would you call it? So the underhanded Chinese malign influence. So there's a whole just a whole underground network of malign finance and kind of underground criminal networks that are enabled by the Chinese Communist Party, that the Chinese Communist Party permits to exist, despite not liking them very much, but permits to exist around the world because they do a good job of undermining legal systems and societies in rival nations. So a good example of this, I believe, would be a lot of the fentanyl, so the fentanyl crisis at the border between Mexico and America. There is a whole network of Chinese money launderers and Chinese financial, kind of quasi-official financial institutions that work with, Mexican drug cartels that are funneling fentanyl into America and other drugs too. There's a major fentanyl crisis here. Now,
amazing example, and also just to double down on it, it is not done by sort of underground actors in China. It's almost sort of signed off on a state level.
Yeah, it would otherwise be punished. And the people who sign off on it, they're in China at the local level, there'll be well-known people who may say they own a local factory, they have party connections. And they're running, underground criminal drug rings around the world. They're funneling the money through the Cayman, the British Virgin Islands is a major destination of dirty Chinese money that's connected to the CCP. A lot of the money is funneled then through Macau casinos and also through properties in Vancouver, Canada. There's a whole underground, like this circular network of dirty money that goes around the world that originates through Chinese operations that undermine other societies like drug trafficking. And so the thing is that, I don't think there, if you go to the highest echelons of the party in Beijing, I don't think there's someone sitting there signing off and saying like, yeah, let's sell drugs to Americans and screw them over and get them hooked on opium like what happened to us 150 years ago. I think that it's more that they know about it and they quietly tolerate it because remember, this is the largest and most sophisticated police state in the world, one of the most sophisticated that the world has ever seen. And if they wanted to stop these transnational criminal networks, they could. Another major problem coming from China has been during the pandemic these just a wave of counterfeit masks. So 3M is a company that is a major maker of masks, of these N95 masks that would protect, hospital workers from the pandemic. And just like these criminal networks, that had been stealing American intellectual property because we were manufacturing our materials in China, they would steal the IP, they would make their own masks, they would put fake logos on it. And not only that, but these actually infected the healthcare supply chain in America. There were fake Chinese masks at the height of the pandemic going around being worn by doctors, worn by nurses, not protective at all. And yet, the Chinese Communist Party, just kind of sits back and lets this happen. I mean, they could stop this. They know, they have data now on everyone, and they know who is doing this. They know who's behind this. So why don't these criminal networks, why aren't they arrested in China? Like, why doesn't the party crack down? And it's because there's a lot of money being made, but also there's a malign influence. The Chinese Communist Party does not want, always like quality masks going to Americans. It doesn't want, good pharmaceuticals and good drugs making it to American shores. I think that there is an interest in undermining democracies around the world in whatever way they can.
Yeah. Wow. Great take. The Panopticon, obviously we've explained how it relates to the Xinjiang province and the Uyghur Muslims particularly, but I guess it's also worth mentioning that it's not exclusive to this state. I mean, the 1.3 or 4 billion Chinese people are actually under the thumb of this Panopticon, more or less, I suppose, with different degrees of severity throughout the nation. Do you want to explain a little bit about what it is China-wide, not just Xinjiang, but China-wide, how the police state is operating in terms of what they're recording, what information they have access to, the social credit system, something that's been spoken a lot about, then potentially also where the customers are coming from. So I know that's like a Swedish, an English, an American company are the ones that are actually building this software, and there's so much, it's so dirty, once you start sort of looking into it. But yeah, if you could explain that, please.
So the social credit system, this is a good example of a Chinese, a system that was originally set up with fairly good intentions. So the purpose of setting this up was to give regular Chinese people and impoverished Chinese people access to credit. Like this. So in the West, we've had credit cards for many years. Most people here are on the credit system. We have credit scores. The system knows who we are and knows whether we're responsible with our finances. So since China emerged out of poverty so fast, there was no functioning system of credit. It was the average Chinese farmer can't go to the local bank and just get a credit card because he doesn't have credit to begin with. So there was this chicken and egg problem, and it's like, how do you establish a credit system? China leapfrogged China leapfrogged all that, because it came out of poverty so fast, and since everyone had a cheap smartphone, like everyone could afford a decent smartphone in China. Everyone had one. Everyone had WeChat. Everyone had these apps that were gathering data. One day people started saying, well, why don't we use all this data? Not just for surveillance, but why don't we use this data to give people like credit rankings, so then they can, they can get things that they can get a car, or they can get a loan, they can get a job or whatever. Now what happened was that in the true authoritarian party style, this didn't, like, this went beyond just getting mortgages. It wasn't like you need a loan to buy a condo. Like this went further, and it was, okay, we're going to check your social credit ranking, to whether or not we're going to give you a job, or whether or not you can book a flight and leave the country. Like if your social credit ranking is too low, then you're basically screwed. Like you're not going to get into a good school. You're not your kids are going to have lower prospects in life. You're not going to be able to rent the apartment you've wanted. Like in America we do,
like it's the ultimate flex of power.
It's the ultimate flex of power.
I have the knobs on determining what route you go down in life.
Exactly.
It's so dystopian.
It's so dystopian. And for a long time, social credit, people were wondering whether this was going to actually become a force in Chinese society, because it was actually being built by a number of different companies who had their own separate systems. Like there was no overarching Orwellian all-seeing eye for a long time. But what happened is that over time, through a series of laws that were passed, the Chinese government took social credit and unified it under its own umbrella. And now everyone in China has a social credit score that is determined by these cameras that are everywhere. The cameras cover every square meter. Yeah, they cover...
Everyone in China has a social credit score now.
Yeah, by now they should. And the goal... I personally don't have the data on it on hand, but China originally planned, I think it was by 2021 or 2020, they plan to have the full social credit system rolled out with everyone having one of these scores. And so now what that means is that, if you're a Chinese citizen, you're going about your life, this is not just with the Uyghurs anymore, this is just everyone is being monitored by cameras, by, purchases, WeChat purchases, what they buy at the grocery store, and their social credit ranking is going up or down, based on the algorithm's understanding of what kind of person you are. So that's a huge flex of power. This is the rollout of what happened in Western China to the rest of China. There are other countries, authoritarian countries in particular, that want this technology, that are interested in applying it to their own people. And so, that's I think that's the next stage. I think that the 2010s was the decade of these atrocities just starting. With the Uyghurs, and these experiments were beginning, the concentration camps were being set up. And I think now the 2020s is going to be the decade of, these systems being solidified, not just in China, but in other countries that want them. And we're going to see these new styles of authoritarian rule based on new technologies kind of being, I guess, maturing into something that's not just about Uyghurs and not just about minorities, but just about general surveillance where governments want them.
Yeah. Unbelievable. And how have you gotten in any sort of trouble running up with the CCP? Because obviously you've now released a very damning book against the CCP. Your career has been very closely affiliated with Asia and China as well. I imagine there's sort of a lot of relationships and connections that you don't want to leave behind there, or could potentially be at risk, you know. Have you experienced anything so far, and do you expect to experience anything?
So far, I have not experienced anything directly against me. I mean, I do get trolled on Twitter by. I suspect there are bots. There are lots of Chinese bots out there, but for the most part, I have not heard a direct response from the Chinese Communist Party or its agents. So, you know, I am stateside now. I would not want to be. I don't think I can ever go back to China. I'm sure that by now my visa has been canceled, or
Sure,
I'll
yeah.
be turned away or detained at the border if I try to go there.
Yeah.
But it's not really me that I'm worried about. I'm more concerned about protecting my sources, the Uyghur sources.
Yeah.
And I've done a lot for the ones who wanted their identities concealed. I've just gone out of my way and done everything I can to protect their data, protect their information. I've set up a vast, a very thorough cybersecurity system that's designed for, defending against state hacking attacks. I have lots of data that's only saved on physical, drives, or that are only printed on paper. Yes, I can't get into too much detail about that because
Yeah,
I
fair
don't
enough,
want
fair
those
enough.
people. Yeah, I don't want those whoever's listening to gather data and to try to devise a strategy to break in. But I've done everything I possibly can to protect the people who helped me write this book, because they really did go out of their way, and they took enormous risks telling their stories in places where they're not always safe. One man who I interviewed, a Uyghur spy, a spy for China named Yusuf John. I had interviewed him in 2019 over many hours. We spent numerous days together going through his life story. He had defected. He was spying on fellow Uyghurs. And then a couple years after I interviewed him, so he was fine. He lived in Turkey. He was going about his life. It seemed like he was kind of rehabilitating himself, getting on with his life and repairing the wounds of the past. But one day he was about to give an interview. I believe it was on the BBC, and he was talking among the Uyghur community about how he planned on, leaking just all this. He was going to leak information about who the other spies are, how the network works, very sensitive stuff for the Chinese Communist Party. And, word was getting around among the Uyghurs, who it's a very tight community. It's the kind of place where everyone knows everyone. And word got around, and then one day he was visiting a friend in Istanbul in Turkey, and as he was leaving his friend's apartment, a gunman came up behind him and shot him twice in the back, in the shoulder. Now, he survived. He's been recovering. This was in November. And he's been hospitalized. He was nearly paralyzed. I think he's making a good recovery now, but there were concerns for a long time that he might never walk again. This might be it for him. This is just to give an example of the everyday threats that Uyghurs face. It's clear that if you're out there and if you're talking bad about China, or more importantly, if you're revealing state secrets that are Chinese state secrets, then you are under the physical threat of violence. Now, obviously, I don't think that Chinese authorities would chase you down in a place like Germany or like America. I think that most people are relatively safe there, but in a place like Turkey, or the UAE, or Pakistan, or another country that showed some kind of affinity for China, the Uyghurs in these places are not physically safe. And if they do speak out too much, they will be hunted down, and they might even be just killed. I haven't seen that happen yet, but it's a possibility.
Yeah, given everything else that the state has done, it's definitely a possibility. Well, Jeff, I think we've done good. We've done justice to the story that you wrote. The coalescence of the prevailing surveillance state against the sort of historic relationship between the Han Chinese and the Uyghur Muslims, and evolving to the state that it is today. Well, in that case, I just wanted to finish off by asking something about you, because obviously typically on this podcast I would be interviewing you, but the subject matter of your book was just so it really affected me, like almost emotionally, because I just felt so much, maybe this says a lot about me, but I had like this hatred towards the people that would do this, and this like non-understanding of how it could be possible. So that's why. But typically it would be a bit more of an interview asking about you, because you have actually a really interesting resume. I mean, school in Vietnam, wrote a book about Samsung in South Korea, written for The Economist. Now you've written this book about China. You're obviously heavily affiliated with Asia, lifelong journalist. Can you just tell us a bit about yourself to wrap it up?
Sure. So I come from a background as a foreign correspondent. I was based overseas since 2008. I had lived in Cambodia, Vietnam, Southeast Asia to start out with. I actually got my start as a reporter when I was covering a genocide tribunal in Cambodia, the Khmer Rouge Tribunal. I covered the trial of Doik. So Doik is the name of this. He's a former math teacher and also a former volunteer from World Vision, which is this Christian nonprofit, ironically, who went on to become the head torturer of the Khmer Rouge regime. He had repurposed, rebuilt this high school in the center of the capital called Phnom Penh to bring in some of the worst supposed traitors of the Khmer Rouge genocidal regime, and to just torture them until they signed confessions, and then they would just kill them. I mean, I don't think... I'm doubtful that anyone got out of this center. Like, if you were sent there, you were pretty much sent there to die. I got my start covering his trial, and this is something that had always made me fascinated, this topic in, what is it that causes a person or a government or a country to just, implode on itself and to commit a genocide or to commit a mass atrocity. Doik, he was, like I said, he was a high school math teacher, kind of a normal guy. A lot of his peers were French educated at elite French institutions, who had great prospects ahead of them, who could have become doctors and lawyers. And, why is it that they decided in the end to swear loyalty to, a violent communist cause, a violent authoritarian cause, and to, take over the country and to just purge it of, anyone who they thought was just outside their own ideology. That's such a big transition. So yeah, I think that one of the things that I've always been fascinated in writing about, and this applies to Xinjiang too with the Uyghurs, is just how how a system that can look so good on the outside, that can get so much praise, could actually turn out to be quite evil once you go inside the weeds and get to the underbelly and realize what these people are all about. I think we live in an era now where governments and leaders around the world that we once respected, that we once thought would be reformers, I think they've taken off their masks. They've unmasked themselves, and they've shown us who they really are. And this is good in the case of China. I think now we see who China's leaders really are. They're genocidal. They are villainous, and they're doing. They're committing some of the worst atrocities we've seen in a long time. So that's my career trajectory. But also overlaying that, I've been writing about technology. I've always been a bit of a technology, a hobbyist with technology. I've always been interested in reading, Wired magazine and all those, the MIT Tech Review, and kind of trying to learn about how new tech is influencing societies around the world. So when I was in East Asia, I had covered Samsung, like the company in Korea. I had covered Japanese tech giants like Sony. I had spent a lot of time in China. I had covered tech there and been among some of the tech leaders of China. And I found, this is what's really, it's covered in the narrative of the book, but one of the things that I found fascinating throughout my career was this convergence of these authoritarian genocidal regimes and the use of technology. You know, the use of Facebook and social media to spread propaganda, to influence, you know, other countries' elections, to, you know, the use of AI to surveil and control people, new innovations in camera technology and facial recognition and voice recognition, you know, the rise of DNA collection and biometrics, you know, just massive innovation since 9/11 in that field. So, you know, I always wanted to write a book that brought together these two strands, and I saw in Xinjiang when I visited there most recently in December 2017, just the intensity of the surveillance that was going on. I knew that I had to write this book because I knew that the world had to know what was going on here. I mean, I just knew right then that this was going to be a major story of our times, and one that was going to, you know, that was going to have implications for people all over the world. Because, you know, in the West, we have conversations now about the role of big tech and antitrust. Should we break them up? Data privacy, you know, the NSA, the Ed Snowden leaks. Like, we have all these debates going on, this conversation about the future of how tech and how tech leaders are going to be placed within our society. But over in China, what was happening kind of under the radar was just, it was such a worst case scenario. Like, it was just alarming to see it, of what happens when you put these technologies into the hands of people who, you know, don't have any restraints, who you know, have their own interests in making profit, and who want to oppress and surveil a population and get control of that population. So that's where I come from. That's you know, how I write the book. I've also spent many years in the Middle East. I lived in Turkey for 3 years. I've you know, gone and reported through Russia, took the Trans-Siberian Railway. So most of my career has been centered around Asia, because, you know, that's where so many of these technological and business innovations have happened in the past 20 years. But also looking outside of Asia, I've really explored Middle Eastern nations, and also done a lot of writing on the history of fascism in Italy, gone into Putin's ideology, and just tried to come together to an understanding of, you know, how is it that this could happen in the 21st century, where we've already been through World War II and we thought that would be the end, and now we're seeing these regimes pop up again in 2021, with nefarious purposes that, you know, in the future are probably going to commit many more atrocities. Like, how is it that we can allow this to happen in a world when we had so much prosperity and wealth, and we thought democracy was on the rise? That's my thinking.
Man, it's fascinating. I'm quite envious of that sort of job as well, where you can be the foreign correspondent and you can be financed to go around and tell stories. I think that is very, very cool.
Thanks,
and I think I've now exhausted all of your goodwill and the time that you have given. So, yeah, Jeffrey, honestly, your book is absolutely amazing. It's unbelievable that the things you write about are actually happening. And if anyone wants to educate themselves more on it, you want to, purchase The Perfect Police State. And just the story of Masum is sort of the perfect anecdote into understanding it, because we can understand things better through example or anecdote or someone's lived experience. So, I think I can leave it with that.
Wonderful. Well, great to chat, Ryan. Great to come on the show.